This is the History of New Zealand Drum and Bass series, celebrating over 25 years of drum and bass in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the New Zealand Drum and Bass podcast, the History of New Zealand Drum and Bass series. My name is Jay. I produced music as Bulletproof from very early on in the New Zealand drum and bass scene right through till around 2012. It's obviously lockdown around the country at the moment, level 4, and I thought what better way to sort of keep myself busy and also maybe bring some joy into people's lives, because I know there's a lot of people around the country at the moment sort of doing it tough and missing out on gigs. Also, you know, a lot of people behind the scenes who are going through an incredible amount of stress at the moment. So I thought, okay, let's start a podcast that not only celebrates and showcases these people and the amazing amount of work that they do, but also the people that were there at the very start of New Zealand drum and bass. We're taking it right back to 1994, 95, going to be speaking to people who were there, and also just document the stories of all your favourite New Zealand producers, where they came from, how they came through, some of their favourite memories, some of the triumphs and some of the tragedies of New Zealand drum and bass as well, and from past all the way through to present day. So strap in, because it is going to be one hell of a ride. We have a lot of amazing drum and bass talent in Aotearoa. We are one of the world's strongest drum and bass scenes. I kind of like the fact that I'm not so present in drum and bass anymore, because I can look at everything with a more objective point of view. I'm not aligned with any brand or promoter or anything like that, so you're going to get honest stories, I'm going to ask honest questions, and hopefully you'll get a lot of honest answers. And you know, New Zealand drum and bass should be celebrated. The people that have built this scene should be celebrated, and the people that are running this scene today should be celebrated as well. And that's what this podcast is about. This very first episode, I'm going to give you my story and about the start of Bulletproof. I was one of the first producers alongside my production partner at the time to get international releases and put New Zealand on the map on the global drum and bass production scene. So I'm going to talk about that, but first I'm going to take it right back to my roots. I came from Christchurch. I went to high school down there after living in Australia for a good chunk of my younger years. Left high school at the end of 5th form, straight into part-time job, hanging out at a place called Hunters and Collectors, selling Doc Marten boots and leather jackets to bikers and skinheads and like anyone who liked that kind of look. And during that time, I discovered I was hanging out with a lot of grunge bands and going and checking out like that whole grunge movement and getting quite involved in it. But at the same time, there was also a sort of dance music scene popping up down there with guys like DJ Pylons and DJ Slipmats and Hamey, who were all sort of putting on parties and sort of mixed genre style parties in Christchurch, you know, trance, a little bit of jungle, breakbeat, hardcore, mainly trance and happy hardcore basically. But it wasn't long before I kind of got bitten by the bug. There was tapes floating around Christchurch back in those days in the early 90s that had been sent over from either Sydney, which had a really strong rave scene, and also the UK, which, you know, to us was mecca for dance music in the early days. And those tapes would circulate around Christchurch, and they would become you like Bible, you know what I mean? They were like an insight into what it was like around the rest of the world and in different dance scenes. And those tapes were hugely important to the development of not just the Auckland scene, the Christchurch scene, but the Auckland and Wellington and Dunedin scenes as well to an extent. And there was a couple of tapes from like One in the Jungle and BBC with Groove Rider and Fabio that came around, and it had a very jungle drum and bass sort of emphasis on the music, and that was what really captured my attention. And it wasn't long before I moved to Auckland for work mainly, and then I really I got my first set of turntables. I discovered some like-minded individuals. There was a guy from Christchurch who I'd known called DJ Riddle, James, who had also moved up to Auckland around the same time. And then I met Aaron, who was one of the first drum and bass DJs I ever saw. he wasn't playing so much drum and bass, but it was the early blueprint of drum and bass. This really dark, sort of 165 BPM hardcore breakbeat, but it was very dark. It was very atmospheric. It had a kind of techie element to it. It was when, you know, producers really started pushing their equipment. Guys like Blame and Justice spring to mind as far as some of the songs the tracks that he would play in his sets, you know. So that sound really resonated with me, and also Aaron's presence on the decks really resonated with me as well. He was kind of a dark and moody figure. He would DJ with his hood up and wearing a bandana, and he was just playing these dark tunes, and it was kind of ominous, and to me he was like a god. But he was definitely one of the foundation layers of not just the Auckland but the New Zealand early breakbeat jungle and drum and bass scene. And he also was DJing alongside a guy called 48 Sonic, who he got his name. That was his call sign from being a cycle courier, and he was one of the fastest in Auckland CBD. And not only that, I think Jonathan had a background in bouncing at certain clubs, and also then got into DJing once he discovered jungle, and I think it was happy hardcore and all that sort of stuff. I'm going to have 48 Sonic on the podcast to give you the full story, but I won't go too deep into it. But that was kind of the start of the Auckland sort of jungle clique. Myself, Riddle, and Sonic would always hang out quite a lot, and, you know, we would be at the record stores playing each other new tunes, or you know, around at each other's place mixing, and all that kind of carry on. Back in those days, it was awesome, kind of little community vibe. And also during this time, I still kind of had a foothold in Christchurch because I really loved snowboarding, and I'd just gotten into it in around 95, and sort of between 96, 97 and 98, I was doing summers in Auckland and winters in Christchurch. So I was kind of back and forth between both scenes, a little bit of a drum and bass jungle nomad, if you will. Anyway, 1995 in Auckland sort of came about. So 96, sorry, my timeline's skewed, obviously. This is a long time ago, and I'm getting memories flashing back as I'm talking about it. So I'm trying to put everything in chronological order. And it's also weird talking to yourself without having anyone sitting across from me. This is weird. I'm interviewing myself and telling a story, so please bear with me. I'm sure I'll get better as we go. A little bit rusty. 1996 rolled around. We'd been doing jungle parties in Auckland over 95, early 96, called Drum and Bass Wise. These were the first documented all drum and bass jungle parties in Auckland, and they started off at a place called Bob Bar, which was the bar that was part of Hotel Debrett's. So you had Debrett's, which was like the nice corner bar on the corner of High Street and Shorten Street in Auckland, and then right next to that was a long, narrow bar with a really cruddy sound system and a stage at the end of it, and that was called Bob's Bar. And you'd go in there on a Thursday night, and usually there'd be some like hardcore thrash band, or grunge band, local grunge band, or even international grunge bands. I remember seeing Jeff Pressure had a photo of Danzig and all that playing at Bob Bars from back in those days as well, early era sort of stuff. So this place was predominantly known for playing rock, but D-Rave and Andy Van had teamed up, and I think they must have known the bar owner or something like that. But anyway, we ended up doing the first Drum and Bass Wise gig at Bob Bar. And the flyer was just a one-coloured green flyer that on one side had the flyer for the info for Drum and Bass Wise the first night. And on the other side said, coming soon, Reel to Reel, which was the Mad Stuntman and Eric Murillo when they did that big tune, I like to move it, move it. So that was going on. It was very, very just DIY and very early. There was, sans serif font and all that kind of carry on. But we did that night and it went off. It was freaking awesome. I think during this time, MC OJ, Otis Frizzell, and MC Slave, Log Cabin, had sort of cottoned on to jungle drum and bass as well. And they were coming and frequenting the mics. And it's fair to say that the first drum and bass MCs in Auckland were MC OJ and Rhythm Slave, because those 2 or 3 first drum and bass wise gigs at Bob Bar, those guys ended up jumping on the mic and toasting, and it was scenes, man. It was absolute scenes, because to us they were heroes. They were our freaking heroes, and they became close friends after that. And it was awesome, because he for a kid coming from Christchurch, and then you've got the guys who were early foundation layers for New Zealand rap, and then they're jumping on jungle and drum and bass. It was special to see. And then guys like Nathan Haynes started cottoning onto it as well, and Nathan actually did his first couple of live saxophone and brass sets over my sets at Drum and Bass Wise, which was awesome. And he went on to team up with DJ A-Sides, who was also frequenting New Zealand to see family around that time, and around 95, 96. And DJ A-Sides teamed up with Nathan Haynes, and they became Cyclone, and not long after started getting released on Metalheads, which to us was just absolutely mental. I mean, it's fair to say that Cyclone were the people the producers that put New Zealand drum and bass on the map first. DJ A-Side's obviously a legend in the UK hardcore scene, so happy hardcore, sort of world dance, that kind of era of hardcore breakbeat, and then he moved into jungle drum and bass, and I think wrote a really seminal tune as well. It was called Caliber, named after the club night where the Breaks was held, the club that the Breaks was held, Thursday nights on K Road at Whammy Bar, which is now known as Whammy Bar, but it was known as Caliber back then, in St Kevin's Arcade. And those nights touched him so much that he ended up writing a tune, and that's was one of his first big tunes on his label called Cyanide Recordings. Anyway, I digress. I am, again, having memories flood back to me from the era, so I'm trying to put them in order. But this kind of, the drum and bass wise things went on, and we moved it to the Voodoo Lounge, which is now known as Cassette Number 9, Papa Jack's Voodoo Lounge. And so it was very much a downtown kind of sound, very underground back in those days, very, very, like small followings, but very dedicated followings as well. And then, I think it was finally after the first 3 or 4 events, we sort of cracked a couple of hundred people turning up. So it ended up moving to a bigger venue, which was Papa Jack's Voodoo Lounge, and those ones went all in as well, drum and bass wise there. And it wasn't long after that I moved back to Christchurch for the winter to go snowboarding, and D-Rave teamed up with a guy that I'd met in Christchurch who just moved up to Auckland, called Jeff Wright, aka DJ Pressure. Those guys were putting on the Subtronics nights. They ended up bringing out a lot of the very first, I think what happened is that they were distributing records and then doing little events around those releases of the records. So say a record label in the UK like Emotive had a new record they were releasing, over here DJ Pressure would put on a release party, whether it be in Christchurch or Auckland, for the release of that record, just to promote the sound and kind of give us a reason to go into clubs and play this kind of music. It was added sort of it was a release party essentially. And those started popping off, and then they ended up organising their own club nights at Caliber, which was the Breaks, which went on to change everything. It put drum and bass on the map in New Zealand. It cemented Auckland as the leading scene for drum and bass. It was really historic to actually see the music that we'd all loved, that we all thought was very much an underground music that was never going to get any sort of mainstream attention, on the news in the middle of the night. Like, it was on Nightline, and I remember like a 3-minute little interview with Pressure and Aaron and 48 Sonic at Caliber at the Breaks night. And I remember looking, I was like, that's my mates, this shit is going to pop off, we're on telly now. I think a lot of it was to do with the fact that Goldie had released Timeless, and there was this kind of b-boy mystique around jungle and drum and bass as well. It was like the new hip hop almost. There was that kind of mentality back in those days, but the foundations were very different. It was like very, very much based on a lot of young people who discovered an underground sound together, and it became their sound. It became a community. It became a culture, and that was the real definitive moment for Auckland drum and bass when Pressure, 48 Sonic and Aaron were on the news talking about this sound from the UK. And from that moment on, it started getting a lot more press, and people started coming out to the gigs a lot more. And I was living in Christchurch at this time, got put on the Point Blank nights, where we started at Liquor Lounge on Sunday nights with a very, very meagre early crowd, like 20 people on a Sunday night, maybe, and then slowly we built it up until about the size of 100 people on a Sunday night, and that was a small bar, so 100 people rammed in there became a scene. You know, it was awesome. It was a nice little vibe in there on a Sunday, and we had guys coming up and just trying their luck on the decks, guys coming up and trying their lucks on the mic, and just sort of like it was a little breeding ground for Christchurch's drum and bass scene on a Sunday evening. And not long after that, the Liquor Lounge closed down, and we ended up moving to Colombo Street, and a guy called Sam Ansley, who owned a bar called Bass on Colombo Street, was keen to do a Thursday night and try and get something like that was what was happening in Auckland happening in Christchurch on the main street. And so we started the Point Blank night there, and that was myself, Mr. Steele, Medellin, DJ Sean. We all would play on Thursday nights under the Point Blank banner, and MC Green as well would be on the mic. And these were the early nights for the Christchurch scene. And then other crews like Scientific with DJ Moses and Pylon started putting on parties there at the same venue as well. And at the same time, Subtronics had just started bringing through international. So I think we had like DJ Trace, and we had Groove Rider, we had Brian G, all these amazing pillars of the UK drum and bass scene coming out to New Zealand, and they were playing either Auckland and Wellington or Auckland and Christchurch, or Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. And these were just carnage. That's the best way to describe it. Like, when we would find out that an international was coming to New Zealand, people would go bonkers. These nights were important because it was a lifeline into the scene. It was a glimpse into the music that was coming out of the UK for the next 2 years, because back in those days, those DJs were all playing dub plates, and if you had the hot dub plates, you would end up in the countries that wanted to hear those dub plates. And guys like Groove Rider, the absolute godfather, Goldie, Chemistry and Storm, Doc Scott, Dillinger and Lemon D, there was just a lot. There was a lot of amazing artists that were coming through New Zealand, and we were very privileged. There was nights that were happening in Auckland at various venues, and then there was nights that were happening in Christchurch at the Ministry. And the Ministry in Christchurch is something you'll probably hear a lot about in this series, because it was one of the most monumental nightclubs. It was the home of drum and bass in Christchurch, especially when the internationals rolled through. And the thing about it as well, the internationals loved playing there. It was like they'd flown as far away as they possibly can from the spiritual homeland of drum and bass, and found themselves in a club that almost felt like it was designed by drum and bass people for drum and bass people. It was industrial. It had a sick lighting rig. It had a sick sound system. The guy that owned it was hard work, but if you got on the right side of him, you were allowed to go past hours. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes we wouldn't walk out of there until 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning after starting at 9 o'clock at night. Just scenes. Anyone from Christchurch who's listening to this obviously would probably be nodding their head right now and just going, that place was it was Mecca. It was Mecca for drum and bass in the South Island. And I've got a lot of very fond memories from there as well. But during this time, around sort of 1998, I found myself playing in Wellington for a gig with Bass Frontiers, I think it was, and my friend Paul Theodore, amazing Māori artist based in the Bay of Islands now, he was living down there. He was like, oh, bro, like, you need to meet my mate Josh. He's got all these synthesizers, he's got a computer, he makes his doof, doof, doof music. I was like, mate, fucking sign me up. Let's do it. So I changed my flights and hung out for the weekends. Got to know Josh, started working on some tunes, and we sort of clicked, and that was that really. I went back to, I think I was back in Auckland after this, and didn't see each other really for a couple of months, and then the opportunity came for me to go back to Christchurch and start promoting again. So I headed back down there, and at the same time Josh, just by chance, had moved down there, and we just bumped into each other at a gig one night, and he was like, bro, let's fucking make some tunes. I was like, in, sold, sign me up, ask no more sort of thing. And we were thick as thieves for about 6 to 8 months just in his studio, just trying to push his, for me personally, I had no background in production. Josh early on was the guy that he knew everything, man. He was a fucking guru. I looked up to him so much because, you know, he knew how to use the plugins, he knew how to EQ stuff, he knew how to get a sound that was almost what was sounding like was coming out of the UK, you know. So, and the fact that he had a couple of really good synthesizers, Juno 106 and also the Roland Jupiter 8, which that became our signature sound for the first 3 or 4 years of Bulletproof and us working together. But yeah, we were making tunes, sort of lock ourselves down throughout the winter in Christchurch, and then it sort of got to summertime, and we kind of tested a few tunes throughout the year at Point Blank on a Thursday night, and it was hard because, you know, the software back then and also our technical abilities and our equipment limited how good we could get our music sounding, and we were kind of, you know, okay, this is cool, but we need to take it to the next level. And then it just so happened that Dillinger was coming to play at the Ministry in Christchurch, and Josh and I went there, and I think we were helping on promotion for it or something like that. But anyway, we ended up doing the sound check with Dillinger. He was somehow, Bruce, who owned the Ministry, let Dillinger EQ his sound system for the night for the entire club. So, you know, Dillinger was testing out, I think the tune he did his sound check with was a brand new tune of his called All Aboard, which was just an absolute freaking monster. This, you know, the tune would put most sound systems to bed, and yeah, he had the Ministry sound system purring, and it was awesome. And then as soon as he finished, I whipped out a CD that Josh and I had burnt. That is a whole other story about how hard it was to burn CDs back in those days, and expensive. But anyway, I said to Dillinger, is it all right if I just do a quick road test of this tune we've just finished? And he's like, yeah, mate, chuck it in. And we chucked it in. There was a CD player there, dirty old Denon pitchable CD player that had every kind of alcohol known to man spilt through it, but still somehow played on the Ministry rig. And we played it, and Dillinger listened to the tune, and he gave us heaps of feedback. He was like, mate, your drums are too soft, you need some compression, you need some limiting, you need to boost this frequency here. It was a masterclass in just him talking to us while the tune was playing, and sort of nodding away, taking down mental notes, and then sort of giving us advice. And it freaking changed everything for us. But the number one piece of advice, and he's like, because I said, we're just struggling, we want it to sound like the stuff that's coming out of the UK. He's like, mate, there's one piece of equipment, and there's one piece of equipment only that's going to do that, and that is called the EMU sampler. Get yourself one of these samplers, get yourself this compressor, get yourself this limiter, get yourself some nice effects, and you'll be away. You guys are onto it. You know, your music's almost there. It almost sounds like it would come out of the UK. So no, just keep on going. It was awesome. Ended up spending like that night and everything hanging out with Carl, and still, yeah, one of my fondest memories of drum and bass. The thing about the early days of New Zealand drum and bass is that these people had flown so far, and they'd come to New Zealand as far as they possibly could, and here was this scene that had knowledgeable people in it. It had a dedicated group of young producers that were starting out, and yeah, I mean, there was a lot of inspiration found at those events, especially the ones that I was at in Christchurch and then later on in Auckland as well. Anyway, I'll get back to the Bulletproof timeline. We had that bit of information and that bit of inspiration from the legend himself, Dillinger, and then we were like, okay, cool. Our focus was getting this sampler, getting a couple of nice, limiters and compressors. So we went about that, saving up for it, and the time came for us, and we got our EMU sampler, and I think a friend of ours helped us get that as well. He was like, look, he just wanted to see us do well, and he was one of our early supporters, and he was like, look, I'll lend you the money. This thing was expensive as well, man. Back in these days, it was like $5,500, which is probably around $12,000 in today's money, and within 2 or 3 weeks of us getting that EMU E5000 Ultra sampler and a new desk and a couple of nice compressors, we had our sound sounded like it came from the UK now. We had learnt a couple of different effects techniques, and the EMU sampler had all the reverbs, all of the choruses, all of the effects that were being used in the big tunes over in the UK. So we knew we were on the right path now, and within maybe 6 weeks of that, we'd come up with a couple of tunes, Hexagon and Communion, and Pressure had started the label, Subtronics with D-Rave, and they also had an international distribution deal. So next thing you know, we're releasing Hexagon and Communion, and that was our foot in the door, not just it was a first for New Zealand because we were the first local artist to be signed to a locally owned, globally distributed vinyl producing record label, which was Subtronics. And we also, not long after that, we caught the attention of a couple of different record labels in the UK, one of them being Perspective Recordings, and we ended up remixing one of their Perspective signees, Pressure Rise, and then ended up getting signing a 12-inch deal for a couple of our tunes called Dead Man and Surge, I think they were called. And that was really when we caught the attention of record labels like Critical Recordings, Commercial Suicide. That was it, basically. We started getting bookings for the UK. We're talking about 2000 here, end of 2000, and then Josh and I decided to make the move back up to Auckland so we could set up a studio in Auckland and be part of the Auckland scene, because for us it felt like Auckland was doing a lot more than Christchurch. Christchurch was a very small scene as far as opportunity for bringing down acts. Subtronics had it covered, and then Scientific had it covered as well. During this time, I'd done a couple of gigs with names like a couple of tours where we'd bought out Bad Company and then Conflict, and then later on DJ Fierce and Matrix. And we were very much focused on that Neurofunk sound. For Josh and I, like 1998, the release of Wormhole, the release of Johnny L's Magnetic, and then later on Bad Company, Inside the Machine. It was very much, that was our sound, that forward-thinking, cutting-edge kind of sound. Those were the people that we looked up to the most. The name Point Blank for our club night came from Ed Russian Optical's track called Point Blank on the Wormhole LP. That was how dedicated / fanboyish we were about those artists and that sound, and having those artists come through New Zealand. Sometimes they wouldn't come down to Christchurch, so it was important for us to make sure that we were in Auckland, which was guaranteed to have the gigs, you know what I mean? And Subtronics were bringing through people left, right and centre. So Auckland became our home, and we started getting bookings to play at Fubar, which was at this time on Queen Street, and I think it was number 155 Queen Street. And it was a little bar that was located downstairs. One side was a little bar called Foo. To your left, as you walked to the bottom, you would have been greeted by a big, friendly lad going by the name of Solomon Cooler. Up top, you'd walk downstairs, and you could either veer off left or you could go straight. If you veered off left, you went into a small little bar that would often play techno and deep house and stuff like that. While if you continued on straight, you would have walked into the actual Foo bar. And this became Auckland's mecca. This place had the most incredible sound system. It had the most electric vibe. Like, I've got my eyes shut now and I'm just talking about it and I've got goosebumps, because when you walked in there, you knew you were onto something fucking special, because it had this blue hue around the DJ booth, blue hue tiles. There was enough room for the DJ and the MC. The way the acoustics in the room were incredible. If you were in the middle of the dance floor, you felt every single aspect of the tunes. It was just set up immaculately. It was set up for drum and bass. It was set up so that people could lose their shit to drum and bass all night. It was a really low ceiling. It had fucking average air conditioning, so it was kind of hot and sweaty in there. And, you know, Gareth and Dan had done, you know, countless hours with tuning their sound system, and it was a really amazing family environment as well. The bar staff were also young DJs who were coming up through the scene. We had the early guys, the very young Ollie Cern and Johnny Cern. We had, you know, DJs from techno DJs working behind the bars. We've got guys who are major producers now who are all working behind the bar and all still work with crews from Northern Bass, which is brought to New Zealand by Fuzine Entertainment. You know, it was a real cultural melting pot for all styles of music and all styles of sound, but drum and bass was predominantly the number one sound there. Friday nights, I think, maybe were hip hop or something like that. Saturday nights were drum and bass, and Saturday nights would often bleed into Sunday mornings. And then, you know, I remember sometimes not walking out of Fubar until Monday morning. You know, just scenes in those places. It was historic, and I'm sure anyone from Auckland who is listening to this right now is like, right, okay, it was amazing. But that's where Josh and I started really sort of making our first headway in the Auckland scene, because we'd sort of, you know, I'd get flown up to play gigs in Auckland here and there, but it was mainly guys like Nick Dwyer, DJ Motion, and coming through on the Subtronics roster alongside 48 Sonic, Riddle, Aaron, all those guys who had been part of the Breaks crew early on as well. But then there was a whole new breed of DJs coming through, and then producers as well. We linked up with these guys named Matt and Evan, and kind of got to know them, and we all started sort of like, it was awesome to have someone else that were far better producers than us, and B, were like really fucking active in the local scene. Josh and I were really focusing on trying to make our headway in the international scene, whereas the Concord Dawn guys were really grassroots Aucklanders who, you know, they had that connection with their pals from school and everything like that, and then they started coming through, and we would be trying to sort of like, I'd come back from the UK and, you know, Concord Dawn with a household name and number one records and all that sort of shit. So like Concord Dawn really it inspired us to just take it to that next level. But we focused on the international scene, they focused on the local scene. And Josh and I were really inspired by what they were doing as well. It was, you know, Matt and Evan had a very rocky element to their music, and I loved grunge, and I loved sort of early, you know, Slayer, Megadeth, Metallica, and all that sort of shit. So hearing Evan's influence and Matt's influence, it was awesome. Josh and I both came from guitar-y backgrounds. Josh had a very synth electronic bass background. I had a very rocky bass background as well. So that was kind of cool mishmash of styles in our productions, and you can listen back to the music that we were all making back in those days now, and there was definitely the Concord Dawn sound, and there was very much the Bulletproof sound as well. So it was kind of cool, and we developed a camaraderie, but we also developed friendly competition, and that was really healthy for the scene back in those days, because it was nice to have someone to compete against, not compete against in a bad way, but someone to. One of the things that I'd always noticed about the UK guys is when they were chatting to you about what it was like back home in the UK, they would always have this sort of, everyone was trying to one-up each other with their technical abilities and their skills and all that sort of stuff. So it was really cool to have that happening in New Zealand as well. And yeah, it wasn't long before guys like State of Mind and of course Shapeshifter had been around in Christchurch and Pacific Heights as well. And then State of Mind rolled through, the Upbeats rolled through. It was awesome. The scene was sort of starting to take off on the production side of things, and that's where we kind of reach around 2003. We'd released a whole bunch of music on different labels. We'd started our own record label as well because we had kind of seen the writing on the wall early on that the way to really maintain control and have full say over your music was to own your own record label, do your own releases. So we were lucky enough through our link up with DJ Pressure to get onto the distribution company, Vinyl Distribution, that was based in the UK that was distributing his record label, Subtronics Recordings. So we started a record label around 2001. It was called Cyanide Recordings. We bought Bad Company out to play a bunch of shows to launch the record label. We made a bunch of money. We went into I had DJ Fresh stay out here for a week. He took us to the Rock Shop in Christchurch with our winnings, and he sort of upgraded our studio. We had the EMU sampler, we had a nice digital desk. He was like, get rid of the digital desk, get a nice analog desk, get these, get this, get that, and next thing you know, we've got like a sound that's very much sounding like Bad Company and Conflict and all that sort of shit. It was freaking awesome. So we were like, we want to put this music out. How are we going to do it? We spoke with Pressure. He linked us up with DJ Lee. We got a distribution deal. Our friends from Auckland, Morgan, he was basically like, right, cool, I'll bankroll this for you. You guys pay me back off your first release. So we were like, okay, cool, we've got budget to do it. What should we do? We had a tune at the time called The Nephilim, which it was kind of like our real one big tune that was like, yeah, this tune can carry itself. You could release this and it wouldn't need a remix or anything. But being us, we wanted to go out with a bang. So we had been chatting to Kamal and Rob Data from Conflict just through email, and then later on late night telephone box missions in Christchurch Square, calling them, talking to them, getting advice on how to use the EMU sampler and just getting a few tips and things like that. And so we'd become kind of close to them, and then we brought them out to New Zealand for the gathering. And then our relationship was such that we just went straight to them and said, look, here's the tune, The Nephilim. We want to start our own record label with this. The record label is going to be called Cyanide Recordings, and we want you guys to do the remix of the first 12-inch. And they were like, done. Here, sweet, awesome. Send us over the stems, and we will do the remix. And then they sent back the Nephilim remix probably about 3 weeks later, and that was that, really. And within 2 weeks of that, a tape somehow was circulating. I think it was Ed Rush on Radio 1 or BBC 1 Extra, and he was DJing on Groove Rider and Fabio's show, and he played the Kamal and Rob Data remix of The Nephilim, and that projected us onto a whole different tier. We were next thing you know, we've got Renegade Hardware looking at us, we've got Trouble on Vinyl looking at us. We were talking to, you know, other record labels that for so long had seemed out of reach and all that. But for us, the number one main focus was sort of like keeping our integrity and keeping control over our music, because, you know, we wanted to make sure that we owned all of our music and that we weren't going to get fucked over. And so yeah, that's what happened. The Nephilim was Cyanide Recordings 001. It came out just around the end of 2001, and it went off. I think it did like 13,500 copies in its first run on 12-inch, and then we pressed another 10,000 more of those, and that took another sort of 5 or 6 months to sell that lot. So that was, you know, our first major success for the record label, and it allowed us to pay Morgan back for the money that we'd borrowed, and sort of set myself and Josh up so we could just solely focus on making music. Around the same time, I found out that I was going to be a dad, and so I was kind of trying to prep for that as well, and also trying to cram as much time overseas getting the Bulletproof name out there as possible. So I took tours for America, ended up doing the States, like a bunch of states. I was the first New Zealand drum and bass DJ producer to tour America. I was the very first New Zealand drum and bass DJ producer to tour the UK and Eastern Europe, and did a whole bunch of different countries. And Josh was never into DJing. That's one thing I should make clear as well. That was when we went to play at Foo Bar and all that sort of stuff. Back in these days, Josh and I would prepare live sets. So we'd drag our studio computer down to Foo Bar and play basically synced up wave files in Logic Audio that went out of our sound card and into the mixer and played out over the sound system. So that was what we would call a live PA, but my background was DJing, and I had, access to dub plates and cutting dub plates in New Zealand and overseas as well. So I would very much be the one that was going out and doing all the DJing, and if we were playing in Auckland, Josh and I would play a live set together and do it that way, and we'd just play our back catalogue of tunes together, one after the other on a thing, and it seemed to work for a while. But anyway, I crammed as much time overseas, soaking up the UK drum and bass scene, making as many connections as possible, because I knew I was going to have to take some downtime so I could be a dad. And so come October 2002, my son was born, and that was the best thing that ever happened to me. Totally changed my life and made me want to sort of take some time off and focus on being a dad and learn how to be a dad as well. Those early years are super, super fundamental, important, and for building those bonds and foundations. And yeah, that was me for the next 2.5, 3 years. I ended up living in the far north of New Zealand, and in a place, just north of Kirikiri, Whangaroa Harbour, a little spot called Totra North. And it wasn't long before the money from drum and bass ran out, very fast actually, and I realised I had to get a job, so I ended up working on commercial fishing boats, which was one of the main industries up there, and I'm not going to say I loved it, but I'm not going to say I hated it as well. It was a culture shock completely. It was the first real job I'd ever had, and that involved back-breaking work around the clock kind of thing, but it was rewarding. I was out on the ocean, but after a while the hours became so long that it was kind of defeating the purpose of me even being up there trying to be a dad, because I wasn't getting to see my kid anymore. And so I started pulling back from that, prepared to take the cut in finances, but also had more time back on land, and also just started dabbling in music again. During this time, between late 2001 and 2003, Josh had been handling all the signings for Cyanide Recordings. So we'd started releasing a bunch of international producers from Canada and America. I think we had some like Eastern European cats on there early as well. And the label had sort of not died out, but it just sort of taken a little bit of a lull, and Josh was getting busy with his IT career, so he decided that it was time to hand the label back, or we were either going to can it or hand the label back. So I was like, you know what, this is working out perfectly. I think I'm ready to come back to drum and bass. So around 2006, I started curating the label, getting a few more local artists involved, and this is around the time I met the guys from State of Mind, and they booked me to come and play a gig in Auckland, and I ended up working in the studio with them for a couple of days on a tune. I think it was called Roulette, and that was or maybe Nowhere to Run. I can't remember, but anyway, it was our first time in the studio together, and they were like, bro, you need to come back. The scene needs you, bro. Like, you're one of the OGs, and I'd kind of forgotten about this, I'd just been so busy being a dad and all that sort of shit, and you kind of, you just forget. And I was like, you know what? And it was those words that really inspired me to try and come back to drum and bass. So I moved back to Auckland around 2006. I was around 30 at the time, and I'd gone through a lot of. It was a hard emotional maneuver for me to move back to Auckland and separate from my kid and not be around as much anymore and all that. But I kind of had him as my main priority for doing this. I wasn't achieving anything in the far north other than becoming a bit of an alcoholic and working on fishing boats. And it was time. It was just time, and it was the best move I made, not just for me but for him as well. And I kind of come back on the scene with State of Mind. Then I head to Wellington and link up with a couple of cats known as Snake and Wolf, aka The Upbeats, Jeremy and Dylan. We did Universe and Rapture. It was freaking awesome. I should actually mention as well, over the years, there was a couple of international DJs that came out and spent a bit of time in New Zealand. One of them was DJ Trace, who lived in Auckland. Another one who came and spent time out here and was hugely influential for me in Concord Dawn was a guy known as DJ Optiv, Ed Optiv, and he became one of our dear friends, and it was just by chance that he got stuck in New Zealand. He came out here and found himself with a ruptured eardrum. So he wasn't allowed to fly anywhere. He wasn't able to continue on with the tour. He did one show in Auckland. His ear was really sore. I think Toby from Cause of Concern did the rest of the tour by himself. Ed ended up staying out here for, it was nearly 3 months, and he became mine and Evan Concord-Dawn and Josh and Maddie's close friend, and we all ended up working in the studio together. So during that time we had a tune called Scorched Earth, which we dropped, and then we got Kamal and Rob Data to remix that for Cyanide Recordings. That was Concord Dawn, Bulletproof, and Optiv. If you want to go and check that tune out, it was one of the it was the first international collaboration in New Zealand drum and bass, and DJ Optiv was a very dear friend who unfortunately and tragically passed away last year, and sent shockwaves through the scene. It was very a very, very hard time. It was so unexpected, and it's still very much raw for a lot of the people that he was in perfectly fine health, went to sleep one night in a hotel, didn't wake up again. Yeah, but Eddie lives on through his music. He lives on through the foundations that he helped lay in New Zealand. But that is just one very important part of New Zealand drum and bass history that I need to make sure I mention, because, he set myself, Josh, Concord Dawn on a whole new trajectory through working with us. We ended up making tunes with him called Camouflage, Black Cell, and Hit and Run. And Camouflage and Black Cell got signed to one of my favourite record labels, which was owned by one of my favourite drum and bass MCs, Rhyme Time, Sean, who was part of the Virus crew, went out and started his own record label to release international artists and some of his favourite music as well. And we found ourselves on that label with Camouflage and Black Soul, and that was a very defining moment for Josh and I as far as having a foothold in the UK scene. Now it was like we have respect. If we went to the music house, people would give us dub plates, let us cut off their dats, and vice versa, because we had these tunes, and we were making these tunes, and that was a real game changer for me as well. I think during those early times, like when one of my first trips to the UK, I stayed out there with Ed, was, around the time that he was making Carrier with DJ Fierce. I remember I caught the train to Guildford with DJ Fierce, and they finished Carrier in front of me, and then we all jumped in a car, myself, Toby from Cause Concern, Ed from Cause Concern, and we went to London, and Fierce played, and they played Carrier for the first time, which is, one of the badass tunes of that era. That I think it came out on Renegade Hardware, or anyway. I digress. This period was amazing because I got to the UK, was hanging out with Optiv. He was introducing me to everyone, and go to music house and people wanting to give you dats. It finally felt like we'd made it, and I think that is where I was going with this part of the yarn, is that just before that time where I took a lot of time off, the things were really picking up for us. But unfortunately, family first, and no regrets on that front. Anyway, fast forward again to around 2006, 2007, I decided it's time to make an album. And that album was my first album, and it was, funnily enough, on a record label called Uprising, which had just been started by Concord Dawn. They were like, you know what, fuck it. You've come back, let's do a big fucking comeback tour, put an album out, you can kind of do a best of, and we'll make a couple of new tunes for it, which is my first drum and bass album called Shake the Foundations, and that's on Concord Dawn's Uprising Recordings, which led me to immediately start touring again, literally overnight almost is what it felt. I had an agent in the UK who'd kept me on her books even though I was dormant for so long, and within 3 weeks of releasing that album, I was back in the UK and found myself touring places even further east, Budapest, Belgrade, Slovenia, Romania, Moldova, just that whole Eastern Bloc area, which to me was mental, but it really made sense once you got out of there, out into those places. I remember the first time flying into Belgrade in Serbia and thinking, oh my God, this place looks third world. And then, flying into Nikola Tesla Airport and getting driven to into Belgrade by Ali, the promoter at the time. It was this awesome half Serbian, half Turkish kid. And I just remember on the way in how excited he was, to have the opportunity to host me. And it was weird. I think for me, I've always had a little bit of imposter syndrome as with being good at something. I don't know whether it's just me or whatever, but drum and bass, especially when I was producing it, I always felt a little bit of an imposter, and I just thought, fake it till you make it kind of thing. But it turns out people thought about us and held us in such high regard, and the further east we went, the more that became apparent. But I remember Ali saying to us, it's man, we imagine what it's like to, be you guys, when you're making your music, and try to imagine ourselves as fly on wall in studio kind of thing. I just remember him trying to explain it to me in pidgin sort of Serbian English, and it was awesome. It was a really rewarding feeling. I didn't realize that my music had touched people on the other side of the planet, you know what I mean? It was such a far off concept and it didn't seem real. But then you get to the club and man, the club night that I played for him was amazing. It was a Wednesday night. I got there sort of around midday, and he's like, oh man, I prepared special barbecue for you. I'm going to take you to my family's home. We're going to have, proper Turkish/Serbian style barbecue. And I was like, fuck yeah, count me in. So we do a little bit of sightseeing throughout the day. He takes me to the old police station. I got a photo of me standing inside a massive hole in the wall that a cruise missile had made from the old fucking Yugoslav-Serbian conflict that was going down back in those early, late 90s, sorry. And we get to his place, and I was talking to him as well. It was cool to hear the stories about these kids who had basically fucking lived through a war and now are putting on drum and bass parties. And he said that during those times it was amazing because they'd never felt such unity, you know what I mean? Everyone came together big time. Anyway, later on that night, have this barbecue, amazing, freaking beautiful food, won't go there. I get to this gig and I'm playing on, it's a barge that's tethered to a wharf on the Danube River, and so you're raving, but say a boat goes past, the whole stage starts sort of rocking back and forwards from the waves. And I remember that night, and I was just playing, and then all of a sudden the music cut out, and I felt something cold on the corner of my head, and I turned and looked right on my temple, and I sort of pushed against it and got pushed against back, and it was a fucking cop. I don't know what they call their police over there, but it looked like military police, and he had a Glock 9 at my head, and he was sort of actioning the cutthroat sort of movement, and I was like, wow, okay. So I just, I minded my P's and Q's and just stood back, and Ali tried to take care of it. And it turned out that they hadn't paid off the cops to allow the party to happen on a Wednesday night in the middle of the river. They thought because they weren't on land, they were exempt from having to bribe the cops, essentially. Some backwards third world shit. That's just one of the amazing stories that I have from my touring days. But a lot of these stories I'm going to save for throughout the podcast, because I can tell that a lot of these are going to become, they're going to pop up in conversation, because we've all got amazing experiences, not just in New Zealand and what it was like to be there, but also all of us early guys and what it was like to be on tour around the world, so far from home and all that. And these are stories that are going to come up through the podcast. I'm kind of going to surmise and say from between 2008 and 2010, I released a couple more albums. One was called Dark Times, Desperate Measures, which was on Cyanide Recordings, and it was amazing. I got to work with a lot of my favourite local and international producers. Go and check it out if you want. It's available on Spotify. I've even got CDs of it available for sale if you want it. And then I released another album as well when I discovered 140. dubstep had just sort of started sneaking through, and my album, Dark Times, Desperate Measures, the first half of it was drum and bass, the second half of it kind of lent itself towards more 140-ish, 150-ish, 160-ish kind of stuff. So you can kind of hear my progression into it. Then I did an album called Soundtrack to Forever, and that won me a New Zealand Music Award, which was really incredible to be, for an album that only sold 400 copies at the time. It was really incredible to be recognised by the New Zealand music industry for that, for the musical quality and for my achievements. And it was something I'll never forget. That was 11 years ago now, but I still look back at that as, one of the most fundamental days of my music career. It really made me feel like I was accepted as a musician in New Zealand music, as well as a producer, as well as someone who was out on the road flying the flag for New Zealand music, and that kind of is, I did that. I loved 140, and I kind of hung up my drum and bass hat, and I really focused on 140. And then for the next couple of years, right through to around 2014, I ended up getting signed to a major record label, EMI, and that was amazing. I did an album called Dub Me Crazy, which charted, and all sorts, did wonders for me. And then I ended up in a situation where EMI was sold to Universal Records, and Universal Records didn't really know the people that were Universal Records that were handling me were the guys, the same person that was handling Lord at the time, so you can tell who's going to get bloody the attention there, and fair enough as well. But I kind of just fell by the wayside, and ended up really being shelved as far as a producer goes. So I ended up sort of branching out and doing different stuff incognito under different names here and there, and ghostwriting for a whole bunch of different producers from the States and shit. So I just kind of got to the stage where I was like, you know what, I feel like I need to do something else, and I also feel like it needs to be something meaningful. And I'd always loved doing radio shows throughout my career. I'd had a bunch of them, 98 RDU, then 95 BFM, and then of course on Up FM and George FM. And I had the opportunity to go into talkback radio to learn how to be a tech producer, which basically means paneling, taking calls, putting ads to air, putting the hosts and calls on air and all that sort of shit, coming up with a bit of content here and there. And I did that for about a year and a half, and then got offered a job at George FM, and that couldn't have been anything more perfect. So I ended up working at George FM, running the night shows and curating the night shows. It kind of worked, and I loved doing it. I loved working at George FM for that time, but the novelty wore off when music the music charter started changing, and I was being forced to play a lot more music that I wouldn't necessarily put my name to. And actually was asked one day, what do you want to be, a DJ or do you want to be a broadcaster? And I was like, you know what, I think there's another way of doing this. And I started a company called Music for the People, which was, I left George FM, started that company not long after, and it was myself, Dylan C, the legend, and Aroha, the legend. We kind of came together, put our heads together. I organised everything in the background, did all the imaging and production. We launched, and we had something like 60 or 70 New Zealand artists that were hosting their own online radio shows on a locally owned music platform. And so that's what I have been doing, and that kind of brings us up to date with where I am right now. A lot of summarizing, but again, I find it extremely hard to talk about myself, so I'm glad if you're still listening that you've bore with me. I have some incredible New Zealand and international talent lined up for this podcast series. I can't wait for you guys to hear the stories told by the people that were there, that did the mahi, and the people that are doing the mahi now, and also in a completely different environment. It's going to be interesting to hear the comparisons, because I know COVID has changed so much for the industry, the way that the industry works, the way that people are inspired by music, the way that people consume music, the way that lockdowns are affecting people emotionally, mentally, creatively. These are the questions I'm going to be asking. You know, I want you guys to spread the word, because this is your podcast. It's really for you guys. These stories need to be told. Some of the things that I've done, some of the things that my friends have done, some of the things that the people who are in charge of the scene are doing now are just groundbreaking, and these stories need to be heard. And that is what this podcast is all about. And I implore you to hit that subscribe button and add us, and you can catch us on all the major platforms. These podcasts will be coming up either one or two a week, or I might just dump the whole lot at one time. But yeah, I'm looking forward to going on this journey with you, and hopefully you're able to find out a little bit more about this music that you love, the reason it's so big in New Zealand, the people that help make it happen. That is the very first episode of the New Zealand Drum and Bass podcast, the History of New Zealand Drum and Bass series. My name's Jay. I'll catch you next time.
You've been listening to the History of New Zealand Drum and Bass series. For episode schedules and podcast information, follow us at NZDNB Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, with new episodes weekly on all major podcasting platforms. This is the History of New Zealand Drum and Bass.